Scott County, providing safe, healthy, and livable communities.
And on to item number 5, Scott County delivers, and I believe Chris Harder will get us started.
Good morning, Madam Chair and Commissioners. We're here this morning for Scott County Delivers, and we're talking about the work that the environmental and natural resources folks are doing around safe, clean water. And that's certainly a piece of work that the county is involved in that spans our safe and healthy objectives. And it's also part of a public trust, right? That people want to believe that the water that they're drinking is safe and healthy for themselves and their children. And so we're going to talk about that work today with a specific focus on prevention. What you're going to hear over and over today is that prevention is cheaper than trying to remedy a problem. And so these folks have put together, I think, some good material for us to look at and talk about their work specific to preventing health or safety crises specifically. So I'm going to ask you to introduce yourselves, then I'll ask the panel members to introduce themselves, and then Mr. Nelson is going to do a little overview for us.
Good morning, my name is Cindy Geis and I'm the Community Services Director.
Good morning, my name is Jennifer Schultz and I'm the Enterprise Risk Manager in the Office of Management and Budget.
Good morning, Suzanne Arntzen, Child Welfare Manager.
Good morning, Marty Schmitz, County Zoning Administrator.
Good morning, Ryan Holzer in the Natural Resources Department.
Good morning, Melissa Bachman, Senior Water Resources Planner in Natural Resources.
Kate Sedlacek, the Waste Program Supervisor.
Paul Nelson, Environmental Services Director, and I want to introduce one other person. Jim Swingler is here. He's the chair of our advisory committee for our watershed issues. So.
Oh, thank you for doing that. All right, you want to start us off, Paul?
Sure. It was about 10 years ago, and I went to Nigeria to look at water issues in Nigeria, and I was in the community of Dumne, and they had an open pit well, 2 hand pumps for 10,000 people, and both hand pumps were broken. And so I asked where a number of people got their water, and they said, well, there's a ditch that's about a mile away that they walked to. And sure enough, about a week before I was there, people had actually died of cholera. That's an extreme example. We don't have that issue here because of prevention activities. And so I think that I want to use that real quickly for just a few examples of prevention. One is, I bet most of you, nobody got up this morning and worried about getting cholera. So prevention is somewhat invisible. If you're doing a good job of it, you don't see it, is one point I'd like to make. Also, the fact that we don't have cholera or typhoid or some of those other waterborne diseases prevalent in the community is a result of collective action. So it's not just staff that are sitting here. We also have Met Council, who is treating wastewater and disinfecting it before discharging to prevent pathogens being out in water resources. We also have the cities who provide clean water to a number of residents. We have standards from the health department on how wells are supposed to be constructed to keep them safe. So there's a collective action kind of thing going on, in addition to Kate and her team making sure that septic systems are working and functioning and not putting extraordinary amounts of pathogens out into our community. This makes things very challenging for measuring, and you'll see we have actually we're scientists, so by nature we deal with data. We understand our data might be a little more technical than some of the other times, but we've been dealing with data. We have had measures since I've been here. So some of our efforts are rather mature. Other efforts are still maturing because of the Scott County Delivers, and we've been adding to that. But a couple things is you don't want to wait till you have cholera to take action. It's kind of late. And so you want to have measures that you capture and inform decisions before you get to these problems and avoid them. Prevention is cheaper than cleaning up after the fact, and that's true also for the flooding side of things. Keeping things out of harm's way to begin with, having our floodplain regulations where we keep homes elevated above flood zones is a good part of that. We also deal with a very long time frame. For a lot of pollutants, there is a lag time For surface water, it's really about 10 years between when you take action and when you start seeing results. For groundwater, it could be 10 years to 100 years to thousands of years. Again, it points out how important prevention is, because if you're going to clean something up that has that time frame too, it's going to be very long. And then we also have lots of variables. We are not only dealing with the amount of rainfall, which is highly variable. We are dealing with the types of soils, the types of vegetation, the slope of the land, temperature, and social stuff. A lot of avoiding things is people taking action themselves. So we have to be in the social side. And on page 2 of the document, we've kind of put together our graphic there of our kind of monitoring measurement system, where we are trying to collect measures along the whole continuum of early on in terms of people's attitudes towards doing things with their own lives or their own properties to prevent things to happening, to the whole collective impact part of it, where we have some surrogate measures. And frequently here, this is where measures of how much regulatory compliance we have is a surrogate measure, versus on the far side, the actual measures or outcomes in the water bodies themselves that we're trying to manage. What is the groundwater quality? What is the surface water quality because of that lag time? So we have measures across that whole continuum. And that we'll take questions from the panel and anybody else.
Thank you very much for doing that. Panel, would you like to start, please?
I have a question. First of all, the information is great. Thank you for putting it together. I mean, it does tell a story. Some of the information that I was looking at, I just have a couple questions on. To begin with, on page 16, when we're looking at the generator, the hazardous waste generator significant violations, I see, you know, a graph, and I'm not entirely certain what's triggering some of the movement on the graph. I was expecting it to maybe be a little bit more strategic, and I understand that there was some employee issues where you weren't able to make some of the inspections timely enough. But can you talk about, number one, I mean, how many current licenses out there, and what should be the trend level that we should see, or what's the standard? How often should these things get inspected, and what's some of the ramifications of them not getting inspected?
Kate, I'm going to ask you.
Yeah, okay, I feel like I can address this best. So for those of you that are first seeing this chart, let me just explain it a little bit because it's a bit complicated. It's a lot of information. So so this left-hand side, the y-axis, it says average number of years since the last inspection. So that is, on average, that's about the last time a business that generates hazardous waste was inspected by our office. That's also that blue bar. So you can see in 2005, when the inspector went out and visited the businesses in 2005, it had been about a year and a half since that business was last inspected. That's what that means. Then on the right-hand side, the y-axis, it says significant violations. So that's a percentage, and that's that red line that's kind of going up and down. So what we're looking at here, what we're trying to evaluate is we believe that the more frequently we visit a business, the less likely they're going to have a significant violation. When we go out and do inspections, it's code enforcement, true, but it's a lot of education and information on what it means to be in compliance, and most generators are businesses. We should call them generators. They're businesses that generate hazardous waste. They're businesses in the county that want to be in compliance. They want to be safe. So when they get the information, they're usually very likely to be in compliance. So what you are seeing here is, back to your question, Cindy, how often should we be getting out there? The large generators, we should be out there once a year, once every 2 years. The smaller generators, we call them our minimals or our very smalls. Think like your local mechanic. More to 3 to, about 3, 5 is pretty long. And if you can see, so from 2014 to 2018, we're not getting out there on average, 5 to 8 years. So we would expect that significant violations would be going up higher. We believe that it isn't simply because we're getting out to those businesses that we know of. We've been out there. Our concern is, what about all the businesses out there in Scott County that we aren't able to get to? We're behind on getting to the generators we know, and there's a lot more others out there. So we think if we were getting out to those new businesses, that significant trend would probably be increasing, not decreasing.
So Kate, in your opinion, is the reason that there's such the gap or the longer span between getting out there a resource issue, staff, or what do you attribute to that?
My opinion is that our HHW, the demand at the HHW and our demand for inspectors out doing septic inspections is pulling the staff to two programs that are in such high demand that they don't have the time to get out and do these hazardous waste inspections. We used to say, okay, well, we'll wait and get out and do these hazardous waste inspections in the slow period, which is the winter when the ground froze. It just doesn't seem to be that now in the wintertime, that happens, that we have a downtime. We just go year-round now.
Let's add a little bit to it. That said, we've had in our own goals each year to increase the number of inspections, and we have. But the number of businesses and so forth increasing at the same time, still a gap.
For people who aren't familiar with the inspection process, could you just give us like one example? Like if we're here to talk about safe water today, like what is a compliance violation that you would hold worry about, like contaminating the water? Like what would one of your inspectors see that would tell you there's a risk?
Sure. So I was thinking of that. I was thinking, how would I best explain a significant violation?
Yeah.
So when the inspector goes out to the business, they're looking to make sure that containers that hold hazardous waste are labeled correctly, that they're closed. Okay, those would probably aren't maybe what we would call significant. It's important, but what we would probably call significant is if someone was improperly handling their waste, they're putting their hazardous waste, they're sewering it, and so now it's potentially getting into the groundwater. That's probably a more significant, or they're spilling their hazardous waste outside and not cleaning it up.
Okay.
And that has the potential for groundwater contamination too. Those are our more significant violations that we're looking for.
Okay. So chemicals, solvents, any of those kinds of things?
Yep.
Okay. Okay. And can I just clarify for Cindy's question? So is there kind of a sweet spot? Like you said, you've set goals to do more frequent. Is there sort of a sweet spot where that levels off in your view?
Well, like I said, we would like to get to those small and large generators every year and get to those minimals and very smalls every 3 to 5.
Okay.
I think what our goal is really going to be is to find those new businesses that have moved into the county, and I just really couldn't tell you what that number is that we're looking for. We'd like to get out there more routinely.
Yep.
And how many are out there that we need to go find, I couldn't say.
Okay. Thank you.
Do you have a sense of what neighboring counties, what the number of inspections look like or the time between inspections?
So the other metro counties have, they're just set up a little differently, that they have hazardous waste inspectors. That's all they do. Where we do, our staff is cross-trained where they have to work in multiple different programs, septic, HHW. So it's only when time allows, where the other metro counties, they have 1 or 2 staff that are assigned to just do hazardous waste inspections. So that's how we're different from the other metro.
Thanks.
So with that, Kate, because we aren't we don't have a single incumbent, or a job that just, that's all that these people do, these staff that do. Is our non-compliance rate, or do we have factors that are affecting our groundwater or our soils at a higher level in comparison, or do we not have the data to really share across county borders, saying because we're doing things differently, we have some higher risk environmental issues in our county?
Okay, so here's my thoughts on that. I don't think that we're higher risk. Dakota County has more groundwater concerns than we do, but that's because of some history they have with some contamination sites and so on that we don't have in Scott County. I believe that Scott County's approach with their businesses is a little different than some of your larger metro, where those inspectors go out, they have their checklist, are you in compliance, are you not, here's your violation, correct it, and then they're on to the next. In Scott County, we have a little bit more of a different approach, where we go in and we want to provide education, we want to provide the information, and we want to make a connection so that they know that they can call us if they have any questions. So our approach, I think, keeps us at a lower risk, where they actually oftentimes call us and ask us what's taking us so long to get out and inspect them. Because we have this trust built with them that we're all just trying to get to the same goal of compliance. So I don't think that we're at a higher risk. But I'm stumbling over it because I don't have any data that shows our significant violations compared to Dakota or Hennepin. I don't know if we're higher in non-compliance or not. I don't have that data to know for sure.
But anecdotally, you've seen some nice results from approaching it from an education and
Yes.
partnership kind of.
I think that's the best approach, yes.
Perfect.
So looking at page 17, I'm assuming this is the, what's dropped off at the household hazardous waste in terms of materials. So I just am wondering from your perspective, clearly it looks like an increase in how much is coming in through the household hazardous waste steadily has increased over the last 15 years, with a spike in 17 and then a bit of a decrease in 18. Just can talk a little bit about why you think that is. Is that because of education? Is that because of what staff's doing, or am I reading this completely wrong?
The continued increase?
Yeah.
The continued increase, I think, is because, one, Scott County itself is growing, and so we have, we're continuing to increase, and as these people move into Scott County, they need to find a place to dispose of their waste. So one, I think it's just because generally Scott County is growing. I do think it's, people are more aware that their hazardous chemicals don't go in the garbage anymore. That's just their, that's the community social behavior. They know to be looking into that. I think that we are trying to get the word more out more. Our department that the HHW is available. This is what we do. We're trying to promote it more, and when we do promote it, we do get, a spike increase. And then I just want to note that little peak in 2017, we think that's because we shut down for construction. For about 6 months. So what happened is everyone kind of came in right before we closed, and then right again when we opened, which happened in 17.
Okay.
And I'd like to add also to this, if you look at it closely, the increase is largely in two things: appliances and e-waste. The actual amount of hazardous waste has remained relatively steady or increased rather slowly, but a lot of that is in e-waste, and a lot of it's because they don't have good places, other places to take it. Which is interesting. We're not mandated to take either one.
What are types of materials that people can't drop off that come to the HHW? And if you can't take them, what's their referral on where they should be taking them? And is there any type of thought about us expanding what we do take, and I know there's probably a storage issue, but can you talk a little bit about what unmet needs are out there?
Yes, one is just the continued demand, and one of our projects with the U of M Resilient Communities, we had an industrial engineering class come out, and they took a look at the number of participants that have come to the facility over time, and we see the same type of exponential curve, and they've projected that by 2030, we'll have probably about a 325% increase in demand. We don't have space to grow and to handle more. There's also push at the legislature to increase recycling. So, if we could take more recycled products, not necessarily hazardous waste, that would help us toward meeting mandated or state-pushed recycling goals. We are in conversation with Dakota County about a joint facility. They are in the same situation, if not worse, in terms of their facility for household hazardous waste is handling about 70,000 participants a year, and it's designed for 15. So they're looking for a second site, and we're in conversation with them to see if we can't get that along the 35 corridor so it could serve some of the residents on the east side of Scott County. Some of the recycling things that there's a push for are other problem materials like appliances or e-waste where there's not other good options for people to get rid of it. Would be mattresses and carpets would be some of the other things. But again, we're not mandated as a household hazardous waste to take that, but we also have separate solid waste management goals handed to us from the state.
On page 20, you have your septic system replacement program. And I have a staff member that helps out in this area, so I know a little bit about it. But I'm looking in 2018, first of all, there's a decrease in how many septic systems actually had assistance. And question is number one, is that because there just wasn't as many septic systems that needed replacement? Or they didn't qualify for funding, or they wanted funding and the funding wasn't available. So I was just curious as to, does the funding that we have at the state that is given to the county, does it meet the needs that we currently have to replace those septic systems? And if not, are there alternatives for these folks, or how do they get their septic systems replaced if they need to be? So multiple questions.
And if I can just piggyback quickly on that, because I just had questions around the criteria for those loans and those grants, and are they income-based, and what does that look like? So maybe just.
Yeah. And the real expert is back in the room here, Mary Von Eschen, on that. So back to the first questions, the two programs, the grants are to us by the Clean Water Fund, where someone at the state agency said, across the state, we got all kinds of septic systems that are failing or straight pipes. We really need to get that fixed. Okay. And so they made grant money available to counties for us to use with low-income folks. And so there are requirements for that for low income. What we do with it in order to stretch it is we don't pay for the whole system. We'll pay for, I think, a quarter of it to bring the cost down for replacing the system on that. And the reason why I think things are down this year or last year was not so much demand, but it was wet. And so stuff didn't get constructed as much as in other years. The construction has to be done during dry weather or the soils get damaged and the system is then damaged. The loans is money that we get. It's kind of a revolving loan process from the Department of Agriculture. And then when stuff is repaid, it goes back to Department of Agriculture and they can make further loans. We charge a little bit of interest, and that goes to cover our staff time for coordinating that effort. And I don't know if I missed anything.
Are the funds sufficient? Is there a need for more funding from the state?
It's a good question. I mean, even when we started the loan program, we had long conversations with administration as to, a lot of these people could afford to actually do it on their own, but they choose to do it as a loan because it limits the payment they have in any particular year, not to, 15 or 20,000 all at once. They can spread it out. So a lot of folks that are getting loans could probably afford to do it without the loan. They're choosing to do it because it spreads the payment out. In terms of looking at the demand, you look at the previous graph, you do see we are increasing the number of systems that are in compliance over time, and that's steadily going up. And that's what we want to see, is that basically the systems out there are meeting current standards, and the trend is in that direction.
Can you talk a little bit, Paul, about that, Brett? How do you determine that? Is that, it looks like over on the left-hand side that a lot of that comes from property sales. Is that the only way you're getting that data, or is there
I'm
other?
going to refer that to Kate. In order to, I will say, in order to keep a data set clean, that's the only data that's in here. Because if we mix it, then you can't really mix two data sets to then have a trend line. But
The compliance inspections can be triggered by either a sale of property, or someone is requesting a building permit from our office, and we've reviewed the files, and we've determined by the lack of information and age of the septic system that a compliance inspection is required. And so in order to get that permit, they have to go do that. So there's a couple of things that could trigger the need for a compliance inspection on a septic system.
So, but if they're not selling their property or they're not getting a permit, is there any requirement around having that septic system checked every now and then? Or is it, I'm in my house for 40 years, I'm not selling it, I'm not getting a building permit, I don't have any requirement to have it
Not a
checked?
requirement for compliance inspection, but they are required to maintain it, so they should be getting it pumped and checked.
we do, the haulers are required to report to us when systems are pumped. And Pete, who's behind you, maintains those records. If we have evidence that a system is not in compliance, then they do get put on a list. If they're just basically a failing system, they have 10 years to replace it. Or if they come out failing on these third-party ones. And part of that's because to give people time that if they're in an area that's going to be annexed and get water and sewer, that they don't pay twice within an area, time frame to do that. If it's an imminent health system, which means it has a surface discharge, they have to cease discharge immediately. And in a lot of those cases, they have to pump their tank until they have a system replaced.
Curious about what kind of partnerships. So certainly from social service, we work with a lot of licensed providers, childcare, foster care. And so do you have any sort of cross coordination with the licensing unit around providers who may have challenges with their septic system?
We do. That would be Mary Vanish, and she's our contact for daycare licensing. When someone comes in to get a license for daycare, they coordinate just by email. Hi, someone is here interested. Can can I direct them to you? And then Mary would, or any of the septic inspectors would look at the status of the septic system and just coordinate back if they see any concerns or if they're requesting a compliance inspection be done on the septic system.
Can we go to page 21, please? So I'm wondering, your team selected 4 lakes in Scott County, and I wonder, when you look at this data, what does it tell you about the safety of those lakes, given the data presented on this chart?
I'm going to start, and then Melissa's going to think of the real answer while I'm talking.
Okay. Well, we'll be interested in that.
Bottom line, this is presenting water clarity. And water clarity is a function of whether there's sediment in the water column that's making the water turbid, or if there's algae. Algae is a plant that can grow, and in more productive, more polluted lakes, it grows thicker, and will mess up the turbidity or the clarity. In reality, clarity has little connection to either health or safety. It's purely an aesthetic type of thing. That said, there can be conditions where lakes are so productive that they grow blue-green algae, and they'll grow it in a quantity such that blue-green algae produces toxic compounds. And there have been cases, and even in the county here, where we've had pets die from toxicity from blue-green algae. But that's not really what clarity is measuring. That's sort of an extreme case. So it's really not connected to health or safety. It's more an aesthetic
Okay,
type of
thanks.
thing. That people swimming will look at the water and go, yuck, I'm not going in there.
Right.
Um,
But it's not unsafe.
Right.
Okay.
Unless it gets to that real extreme level with the blue-green. And in those cases, we do typically put out notices around August when when you get the dog days of summer for those lakes that are subject to that. And then in terms of what the data is telling us here, Melissa, do you have any thoughts on what the graph is telling us overall?
Well, it also gives me an indication of, especially if we were to see clarity really increase one year, what happened in that lake? You know, do we have an invasive species like a zebra mussel, like upper and lower Prior Lakes do have? Or is what we've been doing around the lake and the watershed working so much that clarity increased? So there's certain things that it can possibly tell us if we do see a big change in it. But I can tell you that with Cedar Lake, I do get a call every year from somebody around the lake that they see this blue-green algae and they ask, you know, can I go in the water? And I tell them, we would recommend that you don't until you don't see it anymore, because it can be toxic. So
Okay.
there's certain lakes that we do typically get a call on that say they're seeing it or they're smelling this really bad smell. What is this stuff? And so we typically tell them it's blue-green algae.
Okay. But you would also monitor this data, going back to your earlier point, you would also monitor this data yearly to see if there are changes in the water clarity, or how often do you guys look at that too?
We monitor it annually. Yes.
Okay.
And chart it up.
And this is a, in the county, there are, water management responsibilities are very fragmented. We as the county, the board chose in around 2000 to become the watershed organization for the Scott WMO, and that's about 70% of the county. Middle part of the county is in the Prior Lake, Spring Lake watershed district, and so the monitoring done on Spring Lake and Prior Lake is done by them, actually. So we don't do all this, but we do look at their data.
So I'm sorry, do you mind?
No, go ahead.
So can you, like, knowing that the cities do a piece of it and the county does a piece of it, and are, like, what is the overall picture of water quality in Scott County? If you look at county, cities, who coordinates that data, and what would you say about the overall quality?
Let me ask, how
Sure.
much time do we have? When you ask the overall state, are you overall state of data management, or the overall state of the resource?
The overall state of the resource. If I'm a citizen, I care about the quality of water in Scott County.
Okay. The overall state of the resources, we have a number of water bodies in the county that are listed as water quality impaired, based on standards that have come out of the Clean Water Act. We don't put a lot of that in here because it is very complex. There's a different standard for phosphorus, there's a different standard for clarity, there's a different standard for chlorophyll A, which is a measure of algae, different standard for arsenic, chloride, on and on and on. And it's the state that develops that list. So Sand Creek has a number of impairments. Credit River has one impairment for chloride. Spring Lake has met its standards now that they've been doing some treatments, and I expect it might be removed for excessive nutrients. We've had O'Dowd Lake is not listed for anything. Cedar Lake is listed as impaired for nutrients and so forth. So surface waters, we have a lot of issues. Most of those are aesthetic, or they affect the aquatic life, so the biota of that, more so than public health. Sand Creek and some of the others, or different branches, are listed for having high levels of bacteria. So there are some water bodies that We don't use surface water in Scott County for drinking water, we use groundwater. In general, groundwater is in good condition, or we used to say that. For nitrates, which is what we measure most frequently, we don't really have an issue. Monitoring that we did this last year, Melissa uncovered there are some issues with arsenic, which is naturally elevated.
Okay, can we talk about arsenic?
Exactly.
Keep that one up.
Slide 23. Here's a question. Yeah, I guess my question is just more just on slide 23. Obviously, there's a pretty substantial increase around the arsenic, so can you tell me sort of what that means? What's the potential impact, especially if we're talking exposure to young children?
I'll start and then I'll let Melissa start. It's not necessarily an increase. It's that we only monitored it for the first time last year. So it may have been there for a while. Department of Health has been requiring new wells that have been installed since 2008 to monitor for it. So the map in the back on the next page includes those results going all the way back to 2008. And you can see there's kind of a cluster in the middle of the county. And even talking to the Department of Health, that isn't necessarily new. They found that about statewide, about 17% of wells do have elevated levels of arsenic. And that it's mostly when it's in a glacial till material. So glacial deposited sediment type of stuff rather than bedrock material, so shallower wells. That's our next step that we're gonna take with this, is see if we can't correlate some of this with well depth and so forth, besides getting the word out on it. But as for the health impacts, arsenic is a known carcinogen. And Melissa knows more about this, although we've only really been looking at arsenic for the last 6 months, so.
And we just monitored for it last year because we didn't know that we should have monitored for it in the past when we were doing our watershed plan update. A member from the Department of Health came to one of our technical advisory committee meetings and said, you should monitor for arsenic. So we added that to the list.
So are all rural wells being tested, or is this just certain? And then more around process questions around how often are they tested? Are they required to be tested?
The only wells that have requirements for testing are those that are community wells or municipal wells or used for family daycare. There's requirements for that. The rest of it is, when it's a new well, it's required, and the rest of it is voluntary. Or we do a special study about every 5 years where we try to get a sample across the unincorporated areas of the county to do some testing.
Can you tell me, Paul, what's the, what are some of the methods you use to get this word out to people with wells, to let them know that there was a finding in 2018 and it would behoove them to, whether or not, they're sent a sample, something for them to take a sample of their well and send it into, is it the state, or how do we get this word out to say, we really want to be cognizant of some issues that we were just uncovered, and we would like you to be proactive in testing your own well?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I'd say that's part of prevention too, is getting people to take their own initiative to protect their own health. We routinely have articles in the scene about getting your well tested. In the past, we haven't highlighted arsenic. We will be doing more of that. Jesse in the middle of the room here just created a web page for us on arsenic. And Melissa's getting postcards ready to go out to the townships where we have this, and then we can refer them to our website, which then again has links to Department of Health website. We also, the cluster right around Cedar Lake, we have a relationship with the Cedar Lake Improvement District, so Melissa's coordinating with them to get it to their distribution list to let people know to do that. For the testing that she did last year with the wells that we did get results for, she gave those results back to each of the families that did send water in. We have, for nitrates, we also have a clinic where we set up a test machine. People bring their water in. There's quite a bit there. We also sell test kits at the service counter for folks who want to get their water tested, and they can choose from a variety of parameters to do that. So, number of things, we're ramping up the efforts on arsenic, and we've also brought this up with our technical advisory committee meeting, and fortunately, we had some township supervisors there, and they're very interested in getting it posted at their town halls and in whatever newsletters and things that they have as well.
Do you know, is there any state or federal funding that would maybe be available for us to send or allow people to have these kits at a no cost to try to get at least our baseline for every well within the county? And I know that that's a large endeavor, but if it's financial for some people or they just don't know, I'm looking for some additional methods that isn't going to cost us an arm and a leg to get this information. Do you know?
I mean, we, sell the test kits. They're not terribly expensive. The WMO, other watershed organizations in the county could offset some of those costs. I think the larger cost issue would be for arsenic is the treatment. If you have it in your well, it's naturally caused as a treatment, and you can get it under the counter treatment system that's reverse osmosis or something, but the cost is going to be $100 to $200. For that, there is the potential with the clean water funds. It was part of the conversation this year at the legislature to start having some financial assistance through the Department of Health. So there is potential. Program hasn't fleshed out yet to provide some financial assistance for folks to get treatment. Of course, locally, we could choose to do that as well. Would we set it up the same as we did with the septic, where it's for low-income folks? One of the things that's been interesting to me as we've gone down this road, and Melissa can build on this, is when we've had conversations with a number of people, they've said, oh yeah, we know, and they have treatment. Or when we talked to the Department of Health, they said, yeah, we've gotten word out to people, and just routinely, a third of the people just ignore us.
Is there anything your team needs from other areas of the county, social services or public health, to help with that communication effort? It sounds like you have a lot of different strategies, but what do you need from partners here?
Well, we are putting an article in this next scene on arsenic, and Jesse wrote that, and indicating what some of the health effects are, so we're hoping to get some of that information out to people in front of their face, but I'm not sure if unless Paul has some ideas.
Okay.
I think it would just be, people who live in the area, encourage their neighbors, do it for their own families, and spread the word of what they're learning.
I wonder if we could shift gears for a few minutes into looking at development and runoff and those topics. So I'm looking at page 30. I wonder if someone could walk through this slide and just talk with us about what data in this slide tells you that some of the policies are working. In your narrative, it said, when we look at this, we see our policies on runoff seem to be working. I wonder if somebody can tell me where that shows up in your data.
I'll take this, and then maybe Ryan can add some thoughts.
Okay.
This is it's a measure that I saw a professor do a few years ago, and I thought that would be really useful for us to dive into, and it actually is quite a bit of work to get to. Essentially what we're doing is Met Council operates stream gauges on Sand Creek and Credit River. And that measures the amount of flow in those rivers, and they've been doing that since the early 90s. And runoff in the creeks is a function of the soil type in the watershed, the amount of rainfall that you get, how much evaporation happens, it takes away from that. What this does is it takes the cumulative amount of runoff measured at those stations and then divides it by the amount of rainfall that we had that year. So it takes out of that one of the variables that we have the least control over. And it leaves what it leaves is a function of what's going on the land, i.e. land use, and evaporation is the two things affecting this ratio. So the number in there is essentially the percent of precipitation that makes it as runoff going out of that watershed. Now, we know that as we develop, particularly in denser urban environments, we put down hard surfaces, and that prevents water from going down into the soil. And we have had a number of standards. They really got heated up in the 2000s, late 90s, to mitigate some of that increase in runoff, because while we're setting homes to be out of the floodplain, well, maybe the floodplain's getting larger because we're getting more runoff because we're covering the soil with hard surfaces and the water can't go in or doesn't evaporate, it runs off. So my thought when looking at this could tell us whether or not our efforts to manage that increase in runoff from new development are working or not. If it's, flat, if we're not increasing, it's one of those prevention things, flat being somewhat invisible, that what we're doing to prevent runoff increasing from new development is at least holding its own. What makes it difficult in this situation is at the same time, since the early 2000s, early 1900s, precipitation's been going up at the same time, and while we divide through with it, in this case, it's not necessarily linear. There's still wet conditions. The wetter conditions you have, the more runoff you get, even so. But we find this very positive that when we look at the orange, which is Sand Creek, it's actually going down a little bit. And in Credit River, it's really staying flat. Now, Credit River area is Savage. Credit River Township was some of the fastest growing areas in the country, urban-wise, in the early 2000s. And we're not seeing an increase in the percent of runoff. It tells us that those strategies for holding water with new development is to some extent working on a large scale. And I'll get into scale in just a second. But we went further and we looked at it in the Credit River. Okay, what's doing this? And we found that since the 1990s, there's actually been, if we look at the area's topography and everything, 350 new detention ponding areas have been created because of the standards. And that's holding the water, and it seems to be working on a large scale. What's not really working very well is at a small scale. Backyards are getting wetter because we are having more precipitation and more runoff. It's sort of the collective thing that's working well. Old tile lines are failing, and with the increased runoff, we're seeing wet conditions, and we're seeing people call commissioners quite frequently with concerns and complaints, and so forth. So there's the small scale, we're seeing lots of issues because of the increased rainfall. And the infrastructure, that small scale, isn't the same as the size infrastructure we're seeing at the large scale. I'm sorry, that was very technical.
Did well, thank you.
To touch on too what Paul said, when he was talking about development and trying to mitigate some of the hard surfaces and being able to infiltrate more water, on page 26, it relates back to our cost share program, and a big emphasis that we've been putting on practices is perennial vegetation, or things that can help slow down runoff or infiltrate the water. And you'll notice in about 2013, the ecological, the green, those are more your runoff reducing projects, where you have perennial vegetation, you're converting over an agricultural field to native prairie, putting in a filter strip along a stream, or also soil health. It's the pink, it's on the very top. You can see it's very slight. It started in 2015 and it's starting to grow. But that's a very new program, and that's where we're integrating cover crops into an agricultural field too. So you still have ag, but then you incorporate a perennial vegetation with it. So we've been doing that too with our cost share program, trying to get more into the preventative perennial vegetation that would help with runoff as well.
Ryan, on this slide that you have here, is there, I'm looking at the master county of the rural area and saying, okay, where can we put our efforts toward prevention and trying to mitigate some of these things that we're seeing with additional precipitation. And it looks like this is when people call you or call the Soil and Water District and say, I have this need, or what programs do you have available? Are there other types of outreach types of things that are initiated by you or by the Soil and Water District to try to make people aware that there are programs that may benefit them and may help mitigate or provide a solution in the near term or even long term for them that they're just unaware of?
Yes, good question. Page 28, we talk about the different types of projects that we have. So some of them are preventative, some are corrective. The preventative are more your runoff reducing practices, and we'll do a lot of marketing or mailings to specific watersheds where we know we want to reduce runoff. So we've been fortunate enough to have a grant that actually lets us go outside of Scott County's boundaries up into Rice and LeSueur for the Sand Creek watershed, and we know that reducing runoff in those areas would be beneficial. So we can target those for the preventative practices. The corrective practices are more when somebody calls in and they notice an issue and they want it fixed. And so there is differences, but we try to basically take the folks that are coming in the door and help them, but also then seek out areas that we know would be beneficial for a watershed and try to get practices in those areas. So sort of the difference between what a preventative and corrective practice would be.
And is there funding from the state and federal government to help pay for both corrective and preventative, or only one?
Correct. So with any grants that we have, most of them are probably a 75-25 split where the funds are coming from state or federal partners, and then local funds are the 25% match. But they would cover both practices, so we can identify preventative or corrective practices, so that way we can still administer this to any landowners that are either coming in the door to correct something, or that we can reach out and try to get practices on the ground.
And we've made some other programmatic changes as well. Staff gets sort of tired of correcting self-inflicted things sometimes. That in order to get funding for a corrective practice now, you as a farmer also have to implement in the watershed to that practice the upstream preventive practices.
Just to add on to what Ryan was saying too, the WMO and SWCD puts in throughout the year in the county scene about 30-some articles. A lot of them have to do with different programs that we offer, and saying if anybody needs assistance or wants more information to come call the SWCD.
On the preventative,
Oh, no, go ahead, Jen.
on the preventative versus the corrective, because my question was, have you considered or thought about or been able to do any tracking or data around the savings versus doing preventative instead of doing the back end corrective? Have you looked at that?
Yes, so we do, it's a metric that we keep track of. So we've essentially identified a threshold of a practice. It could be corrective or preventative. And the thresholds can be different because there's different things that we're trying to achieve with a runoff reducing practice versus a corrective practice. So we've essentially set up a threshold that if the price per pound of phosphorus or ton of sediment or acre foot of runoff reduction is at or below this threshold, it's either a good project or a project that maybe needs a little bit more review. And so we've set up different levels in terms of if it comes in below that, the project is more likely streamlined for approvals. If it comes in above that number, then it might go through multiple reviews and a little more scrutiny of whether it is a good project to pursue or not.
Let me add to that just real quickly though. But to get at your question of cost effectiveness between the two types, it's probably not really doable because the preventive practices focus on reducing runoff. Because runoff is the transport for pollutants. And also the higher runoff that you have, the more erosion that you have, versus corrective practices focus on controlling erosion. So the parameters that you calculate for the two types of practices are actually different measures. So this makes it difficult to compare them.
Is there, Marty, is there data that you get from these folks that plays into decisions you make about zoning or land use or permits? Like what part of the work they're doing is most helpful to you?
All of it.
Okay, good, that's good.
A number of the standards that these folks utilize reside within the zoning regulations. Floodplain requirements, shoreland requirements, all of our stormwater requirements, structure setbacks to bluffs and wetlands. All those requirements rely on the zoning ordinance. So when somebody comes in and applies for a plat to subdivide their property, that triggers a lot of these reviews on that particular site. So we look at those sites, we look at those lots to make sure those house locations are in proper areas where we're not going to have flooding issues in the future. We make sure that there's proper erosion control being put in place during the construction. We make sure that the stormwater practices are put in place to help reduce that stormwater, clean it up, those sorts of things. So it's a very coordinated process when we get an application for subdivision.
So do you have the data you need? Like, I can imagine someone comes in, they want to build a house on this exact spot. And you all might see an issue with building the house on this exact spot. And so do you have the data you need to like sort of know how far back is safe or how far back is good? You know, like how do you set those thresholds for the regulations?
And these folks can respond to that too, but they're essentially set during the plotting process. We have the developer identify 100-year flood elevations for water bodies that are out there, because a number of them, we don't have that information today. So when they subdivide property, we get that information so we know that low floor has to be 1 foot above that elevation that's set, and we make sure that there's a location on that property where somebody can meet those requirements. We also make sure that they do soil borings and perk tests on a property to make sure there's proper and alternate drain field sites there. So we do have the information on these platted sites when they come in for development, yeah.
Okay.
I would say that the one area that we have some standards that we don't really know how correct they are is the bluffs. So we do have a 50-foot setback for a home from a bluff. We've had that since 2006. That's not a long time frame to judge whether 50 feet is the right distance or not. 2014, we had big rains, we had some landslides. We had one home that we built, bought out, but we don't have data to go and say, is 50 feet the right, distance? And some of that depends on the slope of that bluff, the materials in that bluff, whether there are springs or seeps in that bluff that are sort of lubricating the soil. That we may find that over time we are seeing more slides closer to home, and staff may approach the board and say we need a bigger safety factor on that one, because we don't want homes falling in places, but 50 feet may be enough. We just don't have a long track record, and those types of events, landslides, are episodic, not something that happens every day that we can measure. They may only happen once every 10, 20, or 40 years with very large rainfall events.
Chris, that was the one question I wanted to ask as you were going down that road, and it was to Marty. It was 31. He's been awfully quiet over there. But Paul is right. There was a house approach that we bought out. We've had another one approach us who sits in a bluff type of area that we really can't do anything about. When we talk about 50% of our plats being revised or changes, what types of changes, Marty, are you doing to protect us from those types of situations and to help make sure that we protect? And what are you doing in those areas?
So with this particular measure, there's a number of factors that come into whether there's infrastructure changes or not. Oftentimes it's just sheer size of the plat or the number of lots that are being created. And what we're looking at are things like transportation needs, expansion of roads, turn lanes, interconnectivity of properties, so we have local road access to adjacent properties and interconnected streets. We're also looking at things such as stormwater management here, and reviewing the practices that are being put in place. Wetland delineations are getting reviewed to make sure that they're consistent with the Wetland Conservation Act. We're also looking at floodplain requirements. That's a big one because we don't have a great deal of 100-year flood elevations for these smaller water bodies that are out in the rural area. So a number of the changes that we are requiring on plats infrastructure-wise are more so related to stormwater and roads. We do get somewhat into bluffs. We had a plat come forward to us at a DRT level here last year where somebody actually wants to build a road up the Minnesota River bluff to serve some lots. The argument is there'd be great views, there'd be awesome building sites, but there are significant concerns when it comes to protection of those home sites in the future because of those bluffs. And as Paul said, you know, maybe some bluffs 50 feet is just fine. You got a fairly stable situation where you don't have water seeping through the soil, but in other areas, you know, what is enough? 100 feet, 200 feet? And it's very difficult to determine some of that.
So that was one of my questions, and it's because we're facing it, I think, on County Road 51. Somebody might love their view down at the bottom of 51, but we spend more money per capita on that road than probably any other. And so when we're looking at that, are you looking at things like, we're never going to be able to maintain a road up that bluff? It might be a great view, but if the costs of the transportation are so significant, are we looking at that and how that's going to be provided and when we're giving feedback on something like that?
Yes, we are looking at that. We do have some standards in the ordinance for what percent slope that they can actually disturb on a bluff. Also, in these situations, it's oftentimes a township street that people are looking at, so the township engineer is taking a real close look at that also. With the advice of people like Paul in our Natural Resources Office, our Soil and Water Conservation District is providing assistance in those areas too. So yeah, that is being looked at.
Just very quickly add that to a large extent, I feel we have good existing standards for development that's occurring now. Most of the problems we had are with stuff that was built before we had standards, and those are probably the phone calls that most of you get, is a home that was probably built somewhere where it shouldn't have been and now is getting wetter. And so those are the ones that we struggle with, actually, from a phone call perspective and complaint perspective, is stuff that was built before we had standards.
Okay. Before we turn it over to the audience, I just wanted to ask the panel, is there anything that you, is there any concern or any emerging need that we haven't talked about already this morning that you just want to speak to? Anything that you are worried about or keeps you up at night is some of the wording we used in some of the planning meetings, but are there any emerging needs that you just want to speak to and kind of give people a heads up about?
I've dominated, so I'll let them.
A big one would be the precipitation increase in that, you know, like Paul's saying before, we had standards, things maybe were built in not the correct place. And if that continues, you know, the standards might need to adapt to that continuing trend. And we've noticed too, the last few years, it's just continually staying high. You know, the precipitation doesn't draw down or have a drier year to sort of catch up. And so we're just facing more of those concerns, I guess.
Okay.
Just to piggyback on that, with you being a little bit more conscious and maybe doing some steps that are a little bit more proactive, because prevention is really the key, what type of feedback are you getting from some of the residents who come in and have to deal with the offices on, you know, too much government and just let me do what I want because I have land rights, and it's not that we're trying to infringe, but we're trying to protect. And so do you see a real change in how you dealt with people, for those of you who've been here a while, years ago, 10 years ago, versus how you deal with them today and how accepting they are of you trying to protect them, not imposing on their land rights?
I would say that Historically, I haven't had too much issue with landowners in a permitting sense when we have a bluff or floodplain to impose standards on those. I think when we started having more aggressive standards in 2006 and 2007, we were coming out of a period where the county board had put a moratorium on development in the county areas for a little while because of some of these issues. We were having so many problems with drainage and so forth. We were building in a agricultural area and we weren't really putting in the infrastructure to handle drainage because it was large lot, private stuff. We saw that and kind of what we have created with our cost share program with the landowner is a public-private partnership to manage water in the unincorporated areas that I think is working better. Is it perfect? No, we still have these residual stuff from things that were probably built in the not great place to start with, but I don't feel a pushback from residents so much. We had some pushback from some of the cities who also then had to adopt the same standards because we're the WMO or the board is the WMO, and we can set standards for the cities as well, and there was some pushback from them.
I would say we got some pushback from developers initially too when the standards were adopted because they were significantly different than what we had before and maybe even stronger than what a number of the municipalities had at the time. But over the last 10, 15 years, developers have, been seeing other communities adopt standards very similar, and they're getting used to, the practices that we have, and it really hasn't been a big issue as of late, I would say.
Good. We have just a couple minutes left. I wonder if we could turn it over for audience questions or for board questions. Audience?
Good morning. Thanks for the interesting presentation. In the interest of time, I'll ask a very simple question here. State climatologists have been predicting that over the next few decades, we'll be seeing heavier rain periods during the winter, more moisture in winter, then really more dynamic winter storm or spring storms and into the early point of summer where we're going to get a lot more rain there, but then we're going to see a lot more drying in the late summer months. How does that change or that modeling change how we're looking forward at things like water storage and development in these standards?
It certainly makes construction difficult, and so a lot of our practices that we put in, we have sort of windows to construct because most of the things are going into an agricultural field, and so you can't do anything while there's a crop. And then obviously winter is difficult too. And we've sort of noticed that our spring construction window has become so narrow where it's very difficult to get anything done because you get the snow melt, you get large rains, and then a field gets planted. So from that perspective, it makes it difficult to maybe do some of those things where we used to have multiple windows in a year to construct something that might be beneficial. And now we're really sort of forced to do most of it in the fall. Or we've also allowed for producers to plant their field to something that can be disturbed to allow for summer construction. So we're trying to adapt a bit to those changing conditions, but it is sort of narrowing up our window to do some of these projects.
I would add one more thing. From the development side, when an engineer sizes the storm sewer system and the ponds and so forth, they use rainfall storm sizes from a technical document that's published for the state. And that gets updated about every 20 years. So if rainfall continues to go, the amount of rainfall that engineers will be required to size their systems for will also go up. Now that creates some lag time or creates some stress on infrastructure, particularly older infrastructure. And again, it's the stuff that was built before standards that's going to have the most impact because there is this sort of self-correction. And there's also some safety factors. Within floodplain stuff, there's the floodplain that's predicted from modeling. Then there's a foot added to that elevation-wise, it's called the base flood, and then the home has to be a foot above that. So there's a 2-foot safety factor in there for some of that. That will absorb some of that.
Thank you.
Other audience questions?
Good morning, Danielle Fox, Social Services. I'm wondering if you can speak to any trends that you're seeing specifically with our senior population, and as that population is expected to grow from about 8% today to almost 30% in 2040, are there things that you're anticipating moving forward?
I would say, that's a good conversation we should have with you. That hasn't been on our radar at all in terms of specific populations.
But we, just to add on to that, we have been noticing that a little bit more with the septics, where we're getting older people not wanting to leave their home or so on. They're selling their homes and they have to do this compliance inspection. So this is our opportunity to start looking at those septic systems. And then also we're getting a lot more proposals for, I'm not sure the correct term of, like
Accessory dwelling unit.
accessory dwelling units. Mom and dad want to move in, grandpa and grandma, but not in their house, but in this accessory dwelling. And we're trying to figure out how we're going to work this septic system. Can they combine it? Do they have to have their own? So we should get together with you and talk about the senior population and how we're going to deal with that in housing.
Nice. Commissioners, I think I'll turn it to you.
Madam Chair, I did just a comment and then maybe a question on how we're here. We started off about an hour ago talking about murky water and how we clean water up. And just a casual observation, I happened to be watching the news one night about the walleye problem on Lake Mille Lacs. And apparently the DNR fisheries experts have determined that as we've been clearing the water in Lake Mille Lacs, that apparently is having a negative impact on the ability of walleye eggs to hatch and thrive. Who knew? And apparently the water's gone from 2 feet to 6 feet in clarity, whatever that, there's a term you use for that. I just noticed. Apparently the lakes we're talking about here in Scott County are noted for their walleye prowess, so we must be okay with that. Just an observation. Bluff lots. We talked about bluff lots and houses falling down because bluffs are sliding and things like that. In this river valley, I'm familiar with a couple things that I deal with outside of my commissioner responsibilities, again, where bluffs slide, particularly onto railroads, and railroads slide. And now we have houses slide, and I heard that we bought someone out because the bluff slid. When did that become a taxpayer responsibility? That's my question.
The theory is, from the disaster management folks, that getting stuff out of harm's way is cheaper than the long term than repairing flood damaged and so homes repeatedly. And that same has extended to the bluff stuff, although it's much rarer. And that was out of the 2014 disaster. There was, as part of the whole disaster relief package, a certain amount of money allocated by the legislature for those types of situations that we used.
Madam Chair, when we do that, does that parcel then become public property? I know
Forever and ever.
In the floodplain, when we buy someone out, that now becomes, nobody's going to buy and build there again.
The idea being that the risk has then been permanently removed.
Interesting. Okay, thank you for the clarification.
Questions or comments over here?
I guess I would just say, aren't you fortunate that storms obey, and when you have a flood every 100 years, it waits wait, well, I can't come back. I mean, some of this was asked, you know, weather's changing, climate change, global warming, that's a fight for somebody else. We should be good stewards of creation regardless of who's in office and what the circumstances are. The question is, with things being what they are and seeming to trend in that direction, and you kind of mentioned you do something today and it might bear fruit 10 years from now, just because that's how creation works and all of those things. Are we us, Scott County, looking at, hey, how do we try to get ahead of something that may trend down at some point, the trend may continue, without being overly obtrusive? That's a loaded question. But I get, weather has sort of, I don't want to say predictable, especially in this state, but you kind of had a run, and now Prior Lake, Spring Lake watershed is going crazy to try to find water storage from the 2014 flood, thinking we're going to have it all over again this year. And who's to say we still might not? But weather's crazy. What are we doing for some of these projects to try to get ahead, knowing that we might not have to, right? But thinking outside the box. And
I think that's a really good question. Human nature is we have one disaster and one home at risk, and we make a knee-jerk reaction and pass some new statutes and things to protect everything. And where is the appropriate line. And I think some of that is by having conversation. We have conversation at staff levels. We have our advisory committee from people in the community that are part of this conversation to make sure that things are reasonable. And the other part of it is to have data along that whole timeline so that you can make informed decisions before it's an emergency. And it's a moving target. I don't have the crystal ball answer for you.
Wait,
I'm also
that's
early in my career. I would apologize for that. But now at this point, I don't apologize for not having all the answers. But I do think it's somewhat of having that data of like the watershed yield stuff that we talked about. Now that took Ryan a lot of work to go into that data. And we could collect a lot more data for you, but boy, at what point are we spending more money on that versus doing things? You do have to sometimes make courageous decisions that aren't going to be popular, or may be popular, or in hindsight may not have been completely, they may have been a little overboard. But guess what? That's what you guys ran for, sorry.
But at least someone's making those decisions, and sometimes they have to be courageous.
And it's for the larger conversation.
And learning from them both pro and con. I think that's, right, we're all in this thing together, it's human nature. So that's a good thing. And you mentioned something about, second question, sort of, the engagement level. You have communications, you have relations with the different groups. And I've seen that with watersheds, which is where my question is going. And I'm asking this question on camera, but is it like, would you like to see a more cohesive, or I shouldn't use that term, but a less fragmented, I think the word was used, watershed type organization for our county, or what would be?
Mr. Chair or Madam Chair and Commissioners, we've had that conversation, and we actually had, I think it was around 2009, we had the Minnesota Administration Division look at different models for watershed management within Scott County, about either consolidating some, or another model might be to have the SWCD be the staffing for all the watersheds in order to have more continuity and overlap and economy of scale with watershed organizations. Still there, still a possibility. A number of us who are sort of the administrators are approaching retirement age. We have less turf to protect, which I think is probably what happened with that study. Once an organization gets into existence, most organisms want to continue to exist. And Leslie was engaged in that as well, and it was a difficult conversation.
Yeah, Madam Chair, Commissioner Buer, I think it was a difficult conversation, but I agree with Paul. I think there's some opportunities to look at that. I got a call from Dave Hemsey, the county administrator in Carver, to talk about the Lower Min and the problems with staffing, and Paul has talked often, and even with Gary, about, it's 100 feet and down to the river is basically what, why don't we talk about that, and is it really needed? So I think there are some opportunities to talk about some consolidations in those areas, as Paul has mentioned, but it was a difficult discussion when Scale broached it. But I think some changes have taken place that might make it a easier conversation.
Or go ahead.
I just wanted to add on to your first question that you asked that Paul answered. One of the new goals in our watershed plan that we just adopted was to create a resilient landscape. So, and part of that is working with landowners on soil health. If you think about how many acres we have that are tilled and they're open, one of the principles of soil health is keeping a living plant on that soil and keeping it covered at all times. I think if we can add more acres in that would greatly possibly help with water quality. So some of the principles that we're starting to implement more in building that resilient landscape, I think will also help.
I was just chuckling on the last exchange, the organisms want to survive, right? Isn't it funny how predictable human nature is? It just is. And I wasn't afraid to ask the question because I know that we have very open relationships with those folks, and I think difficult conversations should not ever be, we should never stray away from those because they're helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. First off, just thanks to the group. I know this was a lot of work, a lot of data, and what a big issue, clean water and soil. And what part of it is our role. That changes, and if we had a little more time, I'd ask you each to address that, but I'll save that. Thanks to Jim for being here. I think our water management organizations, our advisory members and planning commission members are so important to this process, and the ability of them and us to work with the Scott County Soil and Water Conservation District. In other counties in the state, that cooperation isn't the same as here. I hear about that all over, and we should be proud of that, but continue to do that because, like I keep saying, we're all on the same team here. We have the same goal. So thank you for the presentation, and we will recess for 5 minutes to set up the room for the rest of